Hi, everyone. If you are here for the first time, this series is called Leadership COGS. And today our topic is difficult people or difficult patterns. And what I know is many of us might be thinking difficult people and feel very uncomfortable at times when we are at work. Uh, if you don't know me, after years in Fortune 100 firms, I actually realized there was a gap in my understanding. So I made this transition from mastering process and technology to becoming an executive coach. I used what I knew, I studied, I filled gaps, and I became a coach about 12 years ago. And when I think about what I learned in the course of my career, I kind of boiled down all of this learning, working with lots of teams across 44 countries, into what I call the four pillars of progressive performance, or COGS. Now, the C stands for celebrating consistency. The O stands for ownership. G is for growing out of the glue. So when we think about high performance, oftentimes people get stuck. So G is growing out of the glue, and S is for the stamina to stretch into whatever's next in spite of whatever discomfort you might feel in the moment. So I once worked with a client team, and the team was primarily comprised of women. And I remember there was one guy on the team, and he often felt othered. And now it didn't look like it was an othering, but the women on the team would sometimes crack jokes and often remind him that he was male. And while it doesn't seem like that was an issue, it never really felt like it was a big issue, but they would say some things like, "Oh, you wouldn't know about that," or "Let's ask our resident male expert on the team." And it seemed okay, and he seemed okay with the jokes, and he seemed okay with whatever was happening. Now, the entire team happened to be working on this major project. And this particular project was going to affect the entire firm. So as the project deadline came closer and closer, everybody started feeling more stress. And what that looked like is there were shorter responses, probably incomplete responses. Unfortunately, that also meant mistakes were being made because people were stressed. And what we know about just brain science is when people feel stressed, they tend to make mistakes. Now, as the final project deadline approached and there were issues, the team started working extra hours. And again, tempers were flaring. Members on the team really started pointing fingers at one another, and they started casting blame. Now, if you've been in this kind of environment or been in any kind of circumstance like this, you know it feels like a game of hot potato. Like everyone's passing the blame, passing. Finally, it came to the point where all of the fingers on the team were pointing at one person. And shortly after, this person was actually released from his role. And while there could have been a lot of factors at play, one thing in particular was really clear. He was the one member of the team that was not socially on the inside track. So he became the easy point of contact, the easy one to point the finger at. And he was labeled the outsider or the other. And while lots of things could have been happening here, as an outsider, he was less likely to be excused during a difficult moment or difficult moments that might have happened even in the past. And in this story, it's hard to say if it was a pattern of poor performance or if he was even a difficult person. But I tell this story and just encourage you to think, what could have happened? Again, today our focus is on difficult people or difficult patterns, and it touches on two of these letters in COGS, the growing through the glue and the stretch. As a leader, there are questions that you might have to discern if it's the people or the patterns that might be causing issues on your team. So let's jump in and let's talk about this. And first, I'd love to say, what do we mean by difficult people? there's an important shift that I just want to think of instead. So instead of labeling people as toxic or difficult or putting a title on people, which we do all the time, I just want to talk about difficult patterns. So instead of labeling people, we're going to talk about difficult patterns. But it's okay if as we go through this, you're like, oh yeah, the difficult person is that's okay. Because we'll come back around, but just consider that there might be difficult patterns. Because oftentimes not it's not the whole person. It's not the person is wrong, the person is this, person is that. It's a recurring behavior that tends to cause attention. And in the story that I told, it wasn't a behavior, it was simply the person was being and they were labeled something. And in a time of tension, many others couldn't see past that thing that he wasn't even responsible for. So let's start here. The blamer. So what this oftentimes sounds like is deflecting responsibility when something feels like it's going wrong. And what drives it is like a fear of failure. So in the story that I told, there was a fear that any one member might be isolated on that team and be uncomfortable. There was insecurity about individual performance. So what we saw was like groupthink, and people started pointing the finger at one person. The impact is over time, this can create a really toxic, blame focused culture where people are afraid to make mistakes. Like, if there's no person to point the finger at, in that story, it was a male. But when you get rid of that person, who's next? You create a culture where there's a blame culture and people feel insecurity because they don't know if they might be the next. It reduces team learning by shifting the focus away from reflection, from growth, like what happened here that caused all this stress? And it undermines trust. What else? The passive aggressive. So passive aggressive patterns look like this. There might be outward agreement over time, outward agreement, but resistance through inaction or even sabotage. There might be sarcasm that you hear or strategic, oh, I forgot about that. Oh, sorry, not sorry, right? And what might drive it might be discomfort with open conflict. So you might experience patterns of pleasing, like patterns of pleasing where people say, yeah, oh yeah, sure, of course, we're on board. But what's underneath that is just a discomfort with conflict. Like what's happening, they don't want to deal with conflict. And so the response is this behavior or this pattern of behavior that appears as if you're on board, but in reality, they're circumventing or kind of dancing around what actually should be happening. And the impact is there's a lot of confusion on who might be responsible for things, or overall, your team might feel like, hey, we can't talk because none of the talk is true. There might be a lingering sentiment of resentment and frustration. What else can happen? Complaining, a pattern of complaining. And what that might look like is there's always something wrong with the project. There's always something wrong with the decision. Like if we didn't do that, then this wouldn't have gone wrong. And oftentimes what that pattern does is not offer any constructive suggestions on how to change it, but simply another problem. Like there's another problem. Now, what can drive this could be some unaddressed dissatisfaction, some burnout that's been brewing, a need to be heard, but not really trusting the space that you're heard in. And the impact can certainly be on draining morale. Like who feels good when you hear a complainer all the time? So if the team is healthy, chances are over time, that team might become a really loud negativity echo chamber. What else? There may be patterns of know-it-alls. So this is somebody, oh, well, no, that's not right. Actually, it's 2% over, or an always correction, never listening, never listening. Now, it can be frustrating to team members when you have somebody that always has the answer and is never listening to any alternatives. It shuts down voices on the team. These patterns can be really, really damaging and can generate fear or criticism or ridicule in a lot of the people. What else? Controlling. So you as leader might be in this place. So we're talking about a lot of patterns. And I'm not saying who has the patterns, but it might have been suggested that those patterns might have been coming from the team and not necessarily the leader. But I offer you this consideration that sometimes controlling might come from the leader and it might look like micromanagement, overseeing every single detail, taking away decision authority, taking away approval authority, rechecking work, overriding decisions just because. And what happens there is there becomes a really strong sense of anxiety, like, you know what, I'm going to do this, but it's going to be wrong. So if there was courage, if there were people trying to be innovative and do things differently, chances are all of that would change and autonomy, creativity, innovation would be stifled. Your team is restricted from taking initiative or ownership. What else? And talk about two more. One is like the credit taker. So what this pattern looks like is taking credit for all of the team efforts. Like, oh yeah, that happened. And then if I wasn't on the team, it wouldn't have been. And that's what it sounds like. What can cause that? Think about it. Have you seen any of these things on your team? Have you been the one leading some of these patterns? In this credit taking situation, there is such a strong sense of distrust that people start withholding information so that a credit taking pattern might be broken, so that the team or everyone else might be able to delineate themselves from that and step out from behind that. You as leader might be in this circumstance where you're taking credit for everything your team does. And sometimes that can feel okay, like my team did this, and advocating for that effort. But if it's I did this, as if the team doesn't exist, then something might shift there. This last pattern is avoidance, a pattern of avoidance, or avoiding decision making, avoiding responsibility, sometimes disengaging when the going gets difficult. And if you're a leader or if you see your team members who don't feel comfortable in conflict, sometimes being conflict averse is not a bad thing, but avoidance can be detrimental. It can delay your progress. It can create such deep confusion, and it might force other people to pick up the slack to resolve issues. While we all might demonstrate some of these things ourselves, I know I go through this and say, I have to watch myself here, watch myself there. All of these things are aggravated when you might be stressed, when you're tired, or even burnt out. So just recognizing that, just recognizing it alone can help you respond with less judgment or perhaps behave with a little more strategy or intentionality. I say behave, but why do people actually behave or why do they adopt some of these patterns? And when you understand the psychology behind difficult patterns, it kind of helps to respond calmly instead of like, oh my gosh, it's terrible. Like always taking credit. Like instead of casting the blame, sometimes it allows us to access a little bit more empathy. Sometimes what's going on might be unmet needs or insecurity. A lot of difficult behaviors are protective. Someone feels as if they're exposed or violated or some type of fear rises up around an insecurity. And so what that looks like is protective behavior. For example, a controlling person might feel insecure or overwhelmed by change. What else? What else might be going on? Unawareness. So if many of us, while you're here, if you're here with me in COGS, chances are you have a growing sense of personal development or even professional development. You even care about it. That's why you're here, and that's why you're watching this. But there are lots of other people who don't necessarily have the same affinity or interest in personal development. A lot of people don't, this is a new concept. This is not something that they might spend time on. And that lack of awareness, what that could do is cause this to happen. That some people just aren't aware of how they come across. Like, I don't know, was I short in that meeting? I cut you off, but I wasn't meaning to be short. They might not even know that they cut you off. They might not remember that that even happened. We didn't become leaders overnight. That doesn't happen. We didn't become who we are overnight. So in these instances, just using the tool of empathy, a lot of people are who they were for many, many years. And chances are they learned those patterns or those behaviors over many, many years, and they might actually see them as normal. So unawareness. Then lastly, I want to talk about stress. I talked about it a moment ago, but when we're under chronic stress, a result can become withdrawal or burnout. It could also look like aggression or over defensiveness. And if you think about stress like rust on a pipe, like it corrodes any communication. So when we're in circumstances where we're starting to observe challenging behavior and we internalize that and say, oh, this person is XYZ, without really knowing what might be going on there, that's a corrosion because that's not a communication like, hey, what's going on here? The opportunity to get curious and ask a question may not be taken. Like you might not actually ask that question. So stress, burnout, we know that these cause issues with communication and otherwise, and certainly corroding the experience of team. Let's talk about how we can actually respond to any one of these things. So how can we respond? There are a couple things that can happen, and I'm just going to go through a few. These are a couple tools. So anytime we come here to COGS, we walk away with tools that you can immediately start to use. One is naming the pattern and not the person. And I'm very, very explicit here. So rather than saying challenging person, we say challenging pattern. So instead of saying, you know what, Kim or whoever, John is toxic, you might describe what's actually happening. Say, you know, Kim or John, they tend to interrupt and not listen to the ideas during meetings. So name it, be specific. This will help you separate the person from the emotion and the behavior so you can see the situation clearer. And if you were offering that as feedback, then it's not saying you're a toxic person because that's not really fair. We don't know what the situation is that brought that person to show up in that way. It's separate. I noticed that you're interrupting during the meeting. What's going on there? Another thing, don't personalize the pattern. So the behavior says more about the person than about you. So if you're in this circumstance and you're on the receiving end of the person being difficult, as we're saying, or demonstrating a difficult pattern, resist the urge to take things said personally. If somebody's dominating the conversation, it's probably about control and it has nothing to do about you. It's not them squashing you because you're there. It has nothing to do with you. Separate yourself from that. Next, practice the pause. So this is a response tool and this acronym can help. So first, the P is pause. A is acknowledging your emotion. The U is understanding whatever might have triggered you. The S is setting an intention, and E is engaging as calmly as you can. So practice the pause. Number 4, Setting clear boundaries. So if you have a complainer or somebody like, oh, a complaining habit is what you're experiencing, what you could say is, I'd love to focus on possible solutions. So you get to the heart of, hey, what the complaint's not helping. So let's talk about what might help. What else? Using assertive communication. So changing the way, using I statements, I feel XYZ when my work is criticized, or if you're complaining, I feel, using the I statements. So you're taking ownership for your communication about what you're experiencing. What else? Don't stick or don't reward these negative patterns. So if somebody's always complaining, I'm harping on that, and that's a negative pattern that you're observing. And every time that happens, that person gets what they're asking for. What that's building is like a negative feedback loop. Like they complain, they get what they want. They complain, they get what they want. And if that is not the behavior, if that's not the pattern that is in line with the values and the way that your team runs, or the norms on your team, chances are that's going to become caustic. So when you respond in a positive way to a negative input, then what you're doing is reinforcing that. And you may unintentionally be reinforcing that publicly in front of the rest of your team, saying, this is how we operate. And lastly, just know when to escalate. So if you've tried setting boundaries or setting team norms, it could be helpful to sometimes just, okay, there might be periods of times when you win the battle, but you don't win the war. So choose, what is this in the moment? So if it feels like it's damaging and it'll become more damaging long term, then yeah, certainly take action. But if this is like, you know what, that's fine. Just identify what that's fine means for you. And if necessary, if there's an escalation path that is important in your work environment, make sure you take it, or you're aware of how to do that. So we're going to wrap up our show today, our leadership cogs today. Just remember, the workplace is people, just like you, just like me. And by taking a moment just to recognize what patterns might be at play around you, spending some time to understand what these patterns might be and how your response is in those moments, you're investing your time in a positive workplace culture. Sometimes I didn't talk about this, but I'm just going to say this as we close. The most difficult person or pattern that you might experience is the one that you're demonstrating, and not necessarily that of your peers. So I want to end with that. Be kind to the person in the mirror. Show others and ourselves the same grace, patience, and boundaries. Come back to the story at the beginning and say, in that instance, it didn't feel like that person was experiencing any grace or any boundaries. And the fingers were being pointed. But I invite you, just as we wrap up today, to consider this. What might be going on in your environment where people might be labeled difficult person because of some type of a pattern? And just take a moment to identify if, in fact, it is a pattern that you're seeing, or if it might be something else. All right, so I appreciate you for joining us today. I hope to leave you with a few tools. We talked about a couple tools that you can immediately use. I'll be back on August 4th, and on that day, we're going to be talking about change fatigue. So in the meantime, don't forget you can catch this session and others on demand anytime through the app. And if you have any questions, feel free to scan this QR code. You can reach out to me directly. I'm happy to answer any questions. So until 2 weeks from now, I will see you. Take care and be well.